Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth. And today I've got with me Jake Cooper. I've had Jake on before. He's a fascinating young man. He's a clinical social worker. He's a certified Reiki Master. He's a certified hypnotherapist, and he specializes in past life regression therapy. He works privately with clients through online services, and he's been inspired by his near-death experience and his transformative encounters, I should say. He facilitates spiritual awareness and empowerment through life-changing seminars. He currently resides and practices in Long Island, New York, and he's the best-selling author of the book Life After Breath, which I have read and I highly recommend. And the recent release we're going to discuss today is called The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. So I'm going to keep his introduction short. I want to just bring Jacob in to start our conversation.
Brian, thank you so much. I am so glad and honored to be back here on Grief to Growth. I can't tell you how honored and humbled I am to be a return guest here.
Well, I tell you, I've done about 250 interviews, I think now, and there are a few that really stand out to me, and yours is one of them. Your story is fascinating. You're a fascinating person. I love what you're doing in the world. So let's start by telling people a little about who you are and what put you on the path that you're on.
Yeah, well, thank you. That that means a lot. I know you've had some incredible, fascinating guests, so thank you. Keep it up. But I mean, a little bit about myself. I know you mentioned my two books. I wrote, my first two books really about my near-death experience that happened at just the young age of 3 years old. And I'm sure on Grief to Growth, we've had near-death experiencers on, but I'm in a different position because mine happened at such a young age. I was only 3 years old as a young infant. So it comes with a great deal of questions, which sparks curiosity and expanded viewpoints of consciousness. But for me, at least, it's been a double-edged sword to say the least. Having that great euphoria that I had in my NDE, but also having quite a complex trajectory, in my life where I just recognized, hey, as a kid, you're kind of getting, adjusted to being a kid, and you're just learning how to be a kid. And all of a sudden, I recognized I'm not a kid. I'm experiencing myself as a kid, but there's a you beyond the you. There's a world beyond this world, and there's a life beyond this life. And so to have that awareness and then to just come back into reality at such a young childhood age, that's quite a complicated and difficult experience, but I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really good point, because I think there's a reason why we have the veil. We come in and we forget, and a lot of us say
Right.
it'd be great if we could remember, but I know that remembrance at that early of an age presents a special set of challenges. I know Ingrid Hankala talks about that a lot. I think she was
Right.
2 when she had her experience.
She could always one up me in anything. She's awesome.
It's
Yeah,
as I said, reading your book and I know your story, but for the people who haven't heard your story before, tell people a little bit about your
sure.
experience.
Yeah, September of 1993, I went to a playground, or, inside of a park. And at the time, I didn't know it, but I had something called pertussis, otherwise known as whooping cough. And so for those unfamiliar, for infants, children's, and even adults, whooping cough could be fatal if left untreated. It's quite serious. So I had this, cough when I went to the park, and I just, climbed up into a ladder onto a slide. And due to whooping cough, I, suffocated as a result of this cough. And it was the most traumatizing moment of my life. I don't want to shed that lightly. Losing your breath and suffocating was incredibly scary. And kind of like, if familiar with Eben Alexander, I was just kind of put in this period of like turmoil, this incubation period of turmoil where I wasn't crossed over and I was still, experiencing this intense torture and pain of not being able to breathe. But then I was able to let go, of suffering. I was able to let go, of my suffocation. And I found and remembered deep within there was a breath beyond the human breath. And that is the breath of eternity, the breath of creation that we are forever connected to. And so once I surrendered from that pain, I was able to transcend the pain and really have a profound crossing over experience. And this experience, encompassed, encounters with my own spiritual guides. It encompassed awareness of, you know, infinite amount of angels that I was able to see right literally in front of me in the playground. I was aware of, the term or the vernacular is God, but I can't, I'd have to say that's quite a, you can't put a label on it. And, there's a Christ consciousness that I had, which again, rare, given my background, which we'll get into a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Awareness of what I would do in this lifetime, awareness of past lifetimes, encounters with my soul family. So it was profound in a sense, but also not really because it was quite a familiar place, a place, at least to me, where I was always connected to directly or indirectly, even, at that young age, but it was just to me a return to home,
Mm-hmm.
the dwelling of my own soul and a place where we could walk many miles, but we're always connected, deep within the doorway of our heart, to that
Yeah.
place.
So, yeah, I'm just trying to imagine what that would be like at 3, because at that age, I would say kids are not even fully here. You're still like half there and half here. Like you said, it
Right.
sounded like it was very familiar when you went back.
Right. In one sense, like I hear near-death experiencers, there is an incubation period that happens at times when you cross over. It's an adjustment period. I mean, you think
Mm.
about it, you're living X amount of time as a human being, and all of a sudden you just abruptly cross over. It takes time for some to get familiar with. Some automatically, just go right into it. But,
Hmm.
it takes time to kind of process. We still, carry, our own awareness, our own consciousness, and so the scenery around us change, and so we're able to adapt to it and become it, not separate from it. But yeah, I mean, in one sense, it was easier, right? I was, less kind of programmed, if you will, or there was less forgetfulness. Um, but I want to preface that two things could be true at the same time. I always try to say this as a therapist. We live in a very, unidimensional world where we see one thing as true,
Right.
there could be multiple truths. So there was a part of myself that was connected to the ego, to the 3-year-old experience of myself, but then there was an awareness that went far beyond that, and that was the eyes and windows of my soul that was experienced this, which went beyond chronological age. So I think we experience ourselves in different cultures and ages and races and lifetimes, and those are our experiences, but those aren't the full totality of who we are. Those are experiences.
Yeah, you just brought something that's really interesting, because we think of ourselves again as the age we are, right? I think of
Mm,
myself as 60.
sure.
You're in the 30s, right? But when we cross back over, when you're a child, what's that perception like?
You know, I think we could. I think the word is like is it transmutate or transmigrate, whatever. But I think we, like for instance, in evidential mediumship readings, right? Loved ones will come over how they either want to show themselves or how we remember them. But we're not stuck with that one particular, age. I think we're timeless, ageless beings that goes beyond that. So, to others, we could, manipulate or just kind of not manipulate, but just kind of represent ourselves, in different ways that they would understand or that we would want to be shown.
Hmm.
But, we're not just one page of the book that we're currently reading, we're an entire encyclopedia, you know.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
I think what's important though is is to allow yourself to have both that awareness that yes, there's a greater part of myself, but I'm also here to do this human thing too and to be present in
Hmm.
my life where I'm at, not not to be enslaved by it, but to be informed by some of those conditions and to allow yourself to work through and work with and make friends with yourself in this life.
Yeah. So as a 3-year-old, and you have this incredible experience. And I just want to again share some of your story for
Uh,
people who haven't heard it before. How
Sure.
did that? What was it like coming back? And were you able to even tell people about it?
I learned something new every day, not just for myself. I mean, the scenes are exactly the same, right? But as we, I guess, evolve or time elapses, you're able to find more meaning from experience to
Mm-hmm.
degree.
Mm-hmm.
The trauma settles down and you're able to process more. Just last year, my father, who's also, a mental health therapist and a clinical therapist who, is not one of these woo-woo guys, right? He's probably I mean, I'm my biggest skeptic, but he might be my second one. It's just, we come from a very analytical left brain kind of family.
Mm-hmm.
But, he said, sure, and I'll take credit for this, but I'm paraphrasing, but he said shortly after you had your near-death experience, I came to him point blank and I said, remember that day, at the park when I went to the hospital and stuff like that, something profound happened. I can't explain it now. It won't make sense to you now either, so I won't try, but one day it will.
Hmm.
And my dad isn't one to ever stretch, any truth. It's like whatever you see is what you get. Like he's not like one of these guys to, and I love him, but
Right. Right.
he'll put, tit for tat, he'll tell you what exactly it was. So the point that I'm trying to make is it wasn't like I was shouting off the rooftops like the kid from heaven is for real saying I had an NDE. I
Right.
kept it very close within, and the reason is I just think the vernacular wasn't there to properly express it. But also it was for myself to process so I could give it over to others. I mean, I would say we think that we're one, or we say we're one.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that exactly mean? Oneness isn't sameness, but oneness means, at least for my NDE, that we're a brothers and sisters keeper here in God's playground, much like when
Mm-hmm.
I had my NDE in a playground. And so my NDE wasn't just about me, but it was really something that was to be expressed through me to other people. It wasn't really so much about me to a degree.
Yeah.
But within childhood, it was quite complex due to the traumatic brain injury that I had due to suffocation. My brain literally snapped in half at that time when I, suffocated. I felt a large crack. And once, my brain was open, that's when I was able to really cross over and experience the other side. And so I know there's a saying, the brain cracks open, God comes in, and that literally happened to me.
Yeah.
And so from having that experience, my brain was very open. My pineal gland was very open. And so I was able to have a lot of experiences in the other realm and have interdimensional awareness throughout, my childhood. But at a certain point, it became very much of a nuisance, and I just kind of more so pushed it away, and it was just more of an annoyance kind of thing because
Mm-hmm.
it's not something you would just go around saying I'm psychic, I'm intuitive. You just would see things, hear things, know things. You're just like, get these things away from me. I just want to live a life.
Yeah.
So it was kind of annoying.
Yeah, and I think I know it's a very normal response. And I know children that have NDEs, and again, us haven't had NDEs, a lot of times will be jealous, right? It's like, I wish I
Mm.
had this.
All right.
People don't realize that it can take decades to integrate these experiences. For children, it could take, multiple decades.
And I don't want to sugarcoat it. And that was really the impetus, and we'll get into a little bit of writing my second book, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, is you don't have to suffer or go through NDEs to have that awareness. I think people tune into these things because there's a part of themselves that has some degree of recall with what you're saying,
Mm,
and there's a remembrance. Otherwise, people wouldn't tune in. And
mm,
sometimes people could be skeptical or push things away, and that's, at times defense, but they're still presently tuning in because there's a part of them that, is able to remember what you're saying. And all we do is just tap people on the shoulder and just have a gentle reminder that you're more than you think.
yeah.
Yeah.
So how did this impact your childhood, your teenage years, these experiences and the
Yeah.
abilities that you had?
I wish I had my parents here because what I'll say is, you know, in every family you have this, yes, but we ate the same food, we had the same home, we had everything, but I was by far the biggest outlier, within my family. And sure, there's
Mhm.
always the black sheep, and sometimes the black sheep ends up being the goat, right? But but I like that saying. But I was definitely a complicated kid, and I think trauma had a lot to do with it.
Mhm.
Just the inability to put into words what I had, and just this kind of period of suffocation that not only lasted in my NDE, but also in my frustration with this experience that I had, that I wasn't ready or able to just express to other people in the way that I wanted to,
Mhm.
and so just, when I was lying lifeless on the floor and people were just seeing my body and calling me out to wake up when I suffocated, it kind of felt like that to a degree too, where people were looking at me for my body as a young infant,
Mhm.
and they were just seeing me with the physical eyes, but I knew that I was more than just this infant or this child. I was,
Mhm.
a timeless soul, and this wasn't the full totality of who I was. And so
Mhm.
having that recollection made it a lot harder to just kind of fit in or just play the game, if you will, just kind of taking the pill, and all of a sudden it's hard to just come back. So it was quite complicated. I started in a it's very empowering, but I started therapy at 10 years old. I've been doing it ever since. But
Mhm.
and that's really why, in a ways I became one, just to give back what I was given in many ways. But
Sure.
I wouldn't wish it on anyone. I wouldn't. It's not for I think really a lot has to do with it, with your life's chart, and
Mhm.
the pre-plan of your life. I really think that this is something so profound that it has to be selected, by the higher intelligence on either side. It's not just a random experience that anyone could have. I think, it's something that's charted and contracted, in the
Yeah.
pre-birth planning. Definitely.
You just answered my next question because I was going to ask you how you felt about pre-birth planning and whether these things are planned or random. I believe NDEs are customized. They're for certain people. They're universal in the sense that we can all learn from them. But I think you're right. I don't think everybody can
Right.
handle having one because they're really really hard.
No, and everyone wants them. And some people want self-induced NDEs after I talk. And I just have to, you know, I hear them. They want, that, but, you know, not everyone is willing to die to get to heaven and come back.
Right.
Everyone wants to go to heaven, right? But not everyone wants to, is able to go through that pain or that suffering to get there. That's, it's true. Everyone wants to get to the top of the mountain, but, to go through all that turmoil and experience that I had, not just in suffocating, but, having it when I did, it's not for everyone to handle. But I definitely view that there is a higher intelligence that is beyond this lifetime. That nothing is random, and the most profound moments of our life are definitely, um, have chart and higher intelligence, from the higher realms behind them. Sometimes we think this life is just a random experience, and we experience suffering. It could just be like an endless, bottomless pit of, just no rhyme or reason. But
Mhm.
um, I think when you're able to trust that there's more that meets the surface, and there's a purpose behind anything, especially even suffering, that you're able to have more of a guided life and trust life a bit more. But in my NDE, yes, I had that awareness, but I also had awareness after that, where I just kept on having recurring dreams of remembering, just my life, it kind of like, a little bit of the pre-birth planning, like you hear from,
Mhm.
what's his name, like Rob Schwartz talks a little bit about it, but like the pre-birth planning, and I would just have the same recurring image and dream and vision of my life charted before I was here. And so, yes, I do believe that. And at least for me, my NDE, I think, is very closely related to a past life. You know, and I know it's a very sensitive topic, because we all are some degree affected by this on a personal, or community or macro basis. But, you know, I'm not going to say I committed, because you don't commit cancer, you don't commit a heart attack, but I say I had a death by suicide in my last lifetime,
Mhm.
and that's been read evidentially by different intuitives prior to me, getting any way public or saying anything
Hmm.
about this. And
Hmm.
the same description happened from a couple different people. But, in that lifetime, I'm able to understand some of the clients that I help as a mental health therapist, but I just basically had my back against the wall and I saw no hope in my situation. I just remember, taking my own life and well, my own body can never take a life, but I just made that decision
Hmm.
and I wasn't judged or condemned or anything like that. But I saw the NDE as something related to that because I had a similar feeling of just endless suffering. There's no hope. There was no, any way out. So
Hmm.
instead of holding on to the suffering, I allowed myself to surrender to a greater force within myself and around myself. And that saved my life in this lifetime through surrendering. And it's my hope that others will see surrender as not throwing the white flag, but a great strength, of empowerment and help in your life.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I just recently heard someone else say that that because we think of surrender as giving up, as giving over your power to something else. So how did you see surrender?
I think surrender is giving into your power.
Mhm.
You know, we have a strength within us beyond our pain, and who we are transcends pains. I think what's inside of us is infinitely greater than the challenges that we meet in front of us. I mean, I think problems and challenges, have their time frames, no matter how tumultuous they are, they don't last forever, but we do.
Mhm.
And so there's a part of us that could transcend that, but there's also a love inside of us and around us through loved ones on the other side, through the wisdom that we're capable of having, and through earth angels here on this earth plane. I think everyone wants to walk 1,000 miles, in a monastery to find God, and you can, but sometimes we forget that we could find God in the most unlikely places, and they
Mhm.
could be just our neighbors or loved ones. We just don't. Sometimes we forget how special our situations are, the people around us are. We take that sometimes for granted, or we don't know how much our loved ones could be capable of. It could be the opposite's true, but there's a lot more love around us that sometimes we gloss over in this life, I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned soul planning, and I think you mentioned in your NDE, did you get some glimpses of what your life events were going to be coming up?
I had awareness that not just of past lives and having reviews of those lifetimes to understand the significance of some of those lifetimes with this lifetime. But I was able to have awareness of what I would be doing in this life, and I saw myself not just like some pompous speaker in front of people thinking like I'm better than them, whatever, but rather I was just a facilitator of a message. I was just, there, but it was more about the message. It wasn't really so much about me,
Hmm.
but really delivering this message and to see the change on others. And so in that moment, I recognized that the other side will always be there, but this unique opportunity to give what I experienced to other people
Hmm.
is not always there. So to not have to wait to get there, but to allow people, to live their truth and to forever connect to it in this lifetime, bringing the hereafter to the here now, it was really bringing heaven on earth to other people. And that's what near-death experiences can do. We literally bring heaven into this life through our experiences and through our stories that we tell to other people.
Yeah, it's a I'm still wrapping my head around it, and I think a lot of people look at this earth as random. Suffering is
Right.
random. It doesn't make any sense. There's no guidance. There's no loved one. Nobody
Mm,
cares about me, and I'm starting to realize there's like these people our beings on the other side that are very involved in our lives and are very
right.
involved in guiding us. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, having my near-death experience, that's absolutely true. But I love the Albert Einstein reference where he said, kind of paraphrasing, but is the universe a giving and loving place? Is the universe an ambivalent place, or is the universe working against us? So,
Mm-hmm.
our ability to formulate a box of a viewpoint of the universe will really influence the lives that we live. Because in a sense, life is filled with suffering, but there's a life beyond suffering, and it's not just all that meets the surface. And there's purposes, even for the most tumultuous, painful situations. And sometimes we're not privy to that even in this lifetime.
Hmm.
But I think one day it makes sense. And so I think learning how to trust that, our own uncertainties, beyond our own uncertainties, there are answers, there are reasons, and we're able to trust an intelligence maybe greater than our own at the moment.
Hmm.
So it doesn't mean that we agree with it in the moment, but it means that we're able to have a cushion that says, all right, there's something to this, I trust. So, I think faith is not the absence of turmoil, but the ability to persevere even with it. So I think it allows yourself to have those human feelings, but also your ability to transcend those feelings and to trust, in something else as well, beyond that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, I'm coming to this conclusion more and more that probably the most important thing is that view excuse me, the view we have of the universe, the view we have of ourselves, our purpose, because people will say, when you tell people, okay, well, you decided to come here, right? And you decided to have some of these events, the first answer is always like, I would never decide to do this.
Mm,
Why would I do this?
yeah. And again, it's very Buddhisty, but I use it as a therapist, and I'm sure you do this with a client. You know, much of life has to do with perception. Very little of it has to do with actually what's happening in the outside world. And so just utilizing cognitive reframing, or, like the wise mind kind of thing, where
Mhm.
we have one portrayal towards what's happening, we process it on a raw human level,
Mhm.
but then we're able to just see, okay, what's the high road with this? What's a pathway to see this through another viewpoint? And we understanding reality is just how we view it and see, and what we are able to allow ourselves to see, because I don't know about you, but we've lived on this planet, a bit of time, and this planet could feel like a totally different planet when you have a different state of awareness,
Mhm.
um, and when you just are able to have a different experience. You have to have a totally different experience based off of your level of consciousness on this planet, and how
Absolutely.
and what gear you're tapping into while you're living here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I've come to more and more realization. I mean, you could see two people looking at the same thing, and you can see whenever we do opinion polls, is the
Hmm.
country going in the right direction? Is the country going in the wrong direction? The facts are the same,
Right.
but it's how people perceive them, is what people choose to focus on. And as humans, I think we tend to focus on the negative. I think that's a natural part of being a human being.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, in a sense, though, we've been disempowered, and not to knock the education system.
Mhm.
I think it has its place and purpose, but we've been taught in a way that regurgitation in a way is more important than integration of imagination.
Mhm.
That answers were found, outside of us through our left brains versus sitting within and finding, clarity and wisdom. So, I think in a way we've been born to be reliant on external stuff.
Mhm.
And when the external stuff isn't working out, then people don't know what to do. So a lot of people are 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 governed by living outside in their lives versus tapping into the inside to influence the outside.
Yeah, very, very much so. And that's what the perspective that you bring, there's a perspective that the NDE bring, flips on its head, that the true reality is actually within us, and
Right.
everything that we perceive is temporary.
Right.
I hesitate to use the word illusion, because it's real because we perceive it as real, but it's
Right.
not permanent and it's not fundamental.
Oh, sure. It's very real in the moment, but it passes,
Right.
and this transcends it. But it's hard because yeah, no, just a lot of people will start to internalize how the world sees them. We're given names, we're given ages, and the world just see them as blank canvases in a way, and
Hmm.
just on the surface. And so people kind of push away this deep wisdom they had inside themselves, and they hold on to, this surface kind of viewpoint of themselves and within the world, and they kind of hold on to that within their own ego, and
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
that's an issue. And I think there's a forgetfulness, of ourselves as spiritual being, and we just hold on to the human part in our experiences in this life and our stories. So, I think real empowerment comes from not, our life stories, but our ability to define our life stories.
Mhm. Yeah.
What we decide to do. And that was my exact goal in the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder, where what happened to me was something that I walked into, but what I walk out of it is in my control,
Yeah.
and so not to be defined by the story, but to define the story. And I know so many listeners and yourself are doing that, where we have these experiences and those could easily define us, and at times they they will, but we decide to find meaning at a time, from those experiences and value and wisdom, from
Right.
those moments.
So talk about the wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Tell me more about the book.
Yes. The book was released, and I didn't intend to release it on this day. But, a little bit about myself for those aren't aware is I do come from an Orthodox Jewish family. And certainly if I look at a family picture, probably half of my family, was killed in the Holocaust. And my book happened to come on Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Mm.
And if you're familiar with, the Holocaust, they had days where they would just burn any book burnt written by someone who is Jewish or any thought leader who I guess went against the regime.
Hmm.
And so less than 100 years later, to be a Jewish person and to have a book come out on that day was profound. It just
Right.
was very allegorical for the near-death experience. Like there could be death, but there's transcendence of it. There's transcendence of darkness, and life has a way of continuing and going on,
Hmm.
and stories will be told, but we just have to remember it. Much like the Holocaust, never forget. I think with significant moments in our life, never forget those too. Never forget who you are, where you came from, what you're connected to. Always remember that part of you. And the world could try to take that away or rip that away, but we're the authors of our own life, and I think God created us because God loves stories.
Yeah.
And so that's a quote by Elie Wiesel, who's a Holocaust survivor. And so that's really why I wrote this book is within the power of story and how this story could hopefully help out others. But really, life after breath was more of my karma. That was the story of my NDE, where the wisdom of Jacob's ladder is a part of my dharma, the meaning, the message, the essence,
Mm.
how we could relate that experience, into this life. And so that's where I really had to roll up my sleeves and sweat. I mean, I could rattle off what happened to me. That's easy, but
Right.
sitting within this and processing, that's real work lies. And so I named it that title, not it sounds a little bit pompous. I hear that, but it's not. It really is more of a homage, to biblical Jacob.
Hmm.
In biblical Jacob, I think your name tells you not just who you are, but a little bit of your potential to some degree.
Sure.
And, biblical Jacob, who, my name comes from originally, had a dream when death was chasing him or his brother Esau was chasing him, do the covenant and stuff like that. And Jacob rested in a place called Beth El or Beit El or the house of God, which place that I've been to. And when he was resting from fleeing for his life, he had a dream of the angels up and down, running up and down the ladder,
Hmm.
and was eventually able to wrestle um, I guess the angel of death, so to speak, and he transcended and became Israel.
Hmm.
It overcame his demons in a way. So I think for me at least, though, that's something that I could relate to with my name. Certainly, death was running after me, but I was able to write back. I was able to tap into something deeper, and I recognized, death is something temporary, but life is eternal. And I remembered that right when the darkness was coming my way, and I was able to see the light, especially with, past the darkness.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really well said. I appreciate your humility, but you said before we started recording, you said I don't feel like I wrote this book. So
Right.
explain that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think everything happens for a reason, but Brian, I mean, I started community college, locally, and I was in the lowest possible non-credited classes for writing and reading in community college. And I was the most pissed off, angered student because I just know that this wasn't me, that I had more inside of myself.
Mm.
So I was able to use that anger and I just wrote and wrote and read and wrote. But I was lucky to have someone in my first semester of community college who read my writing, and she herself was a teacher for, what's his name? Is it something Feliciano? He wrote that song Feliz
Jose,
Navidad.
Jose
Jose
Feliciano.
Feliciano. Yeah, she was a teacher for the visually impaired, and he was one of her
Mm.
students.
Wow.
So she was into all this stuff, right? But she literally helped the people who could, those who are visually impaired to see, but she did that in a metaphorical way too. She
Mm.
helped others see what they weren't seeing in their lives or maybe tapping into unseen worlds. So she was my definite guide. And she just looked at one of my writings and says, you're a damn good writer. I'm like, well, the outside world isn't saying that, but just because other people are seeing limitations, that speaks that's more about them and what they're missing out on. That has nothing to do with you. And I think it's true with all of us. If the world is seeing us through a limited lens, it has nothing to do with the real you. The real you is unlimited. It's beautiful. It's brilliant. It's not measurable and quantify. I mean, you could do that academically, but that that's not the totality of what's inside of us. That's a small
Hmm.
part that they're looking for you to fit into what they're asking for, you know. So from having that belief, that in a sense that I wasn't this kind of limited dumb kid, but that I was unlimited, made my life unlimited.
Hmm.
When you see things that are impossible, things will be impossible. When you see things are doable or possible, they will be. Whatever
Yeah.
you think, you're right.
Yeah.
So, but I think it goes again with the power of belief and how, for seeing things to be possible or not, and that will influence your life. So, yeah, without her, right, this book wouldn't have been written, or so many people before me. So, yeah, my name's on it, but it's more of an ode and a homage to maybe some people who weren't able to write books, or some of my ancestors who, were in concentration camps, and I just wonder about the potential of people who weren't able to tell their story, beyond my ethnic or cultural reference, how many
Hmm.
people were afraid to tell their stories or suppressed or weren't allowed to. And so my books are written for all those who wanted to tell their stories but couldn't, you know.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier about, us all being one in a sense. And we talked about we've got these outside influences on the other side that are helping us along. So I don't think any of us does anything on our own.
No.
We it's that's an illusion. That's one of the illusions about being here is that we are these autonomous, independent creatures.
Yeah. Yeah. We're programmed, especially in our world. It's very capitalistic. And so when someone is down and we get ahead, it's a good thing. But I don't think it works if it works for everyone. And that's really coincides with the life that I live and all my belief systems where everyone matters.
Hmm.
And it's my hope that COVID taught us that, where it wasn't just someone was sick and we could just push it away. If it doesn't directly affect us, what does it mean? No. I think in a way it directly affected all of us. And
Hmm.
hopefully, that could lead to, based on your foundation, it could lead to more compassion, more empathy for not seeing others' pain as outside, but something that we're all, joined with
Hmm.
and we all have compassion towards. And so, the work that I try to do is for people to really allow themselves to be a part of this world. So much of the world tries to push everything away that doesn't fit their box. And I think the people who are struggling need it the most. And so that's influenced my work as, mental health worker who works very closely with, those who might have high risk or those of the LGBTQ plus communities and, you know, a lot of the marginalized populations that many news media outlets are just trying to put their foot on their necks or kicking them to the curb. But when you're down, why do you need to be kicked? You need to
Yeah.
be heard. You need to be validated. You need to be listened to, not pouring salt on a wound. So, you know,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we have this really weird thing going on in our society because I think so many people, your message, our message, the message resonates with them. They want to believe it, but then they look around them and they see it is competition. There are shortage of material stuff, and I do have to compete with you, and it is a zero-sum game. If I win, you
Right.
lose. And so they're like, I want to believe this, but I'm not really, seeing it.
Right. I think yeah, we have to understand what this life is about. We're not here forever, but our experiences are, and our meaning is,
Mm,
that lasts. And so it's just a matter of what you view as reality. I think you're here to enjoy this world, but, to be immersed in it, but also to have a ripple effect. That to me has ultimate currency, and so I think it depends, but to me it's a means to an end. And it's nothing bad of indulging. I mean, look behind me, I have all my fragrances and all that stuff, but that's stuff that keeps me passionate. I think when you're passionate, you invoke the spirit within yourself, the part of you that brings you joy and it uplifts you. But I think some people, and again, it comes down to reality. Is reality, finite? Then if it's finite, sure, it's like push everything away. It doesn't have no rhyme or reason. Just get ahead, get rich, be selfish, be in your own box. It makes sense. But, is there more than just this life? If you view that, then that will affect your decisions and how you relate to the world and what place you decide to come from. But I think the issue is not just with, uh, finances. I think with a way of life, though, people live that way. If it doesn't directly affect them, they'll push it away, they'll other it, and they'll say it has nothing to do with me, go away, have nothing to do with it. If you're not like me, screw off. That's the way a lot of people are. And I think in a way, like I said before, oneness does not mean sameness. And I think we have diversity so that we could see beyond the surface. We could see the unifying lens, but we could also be more open, universally. And I
mm,
think we incarnate, in different cultures to expand our soul, to understand what it's like to live as such, what it's in. And I think through different cultures and different lives, it's very expansive. And so that's why I think older souls are more universal. They could go anywhere and people could connect to them because they have, so many lifetimes in other cultures and civilizations that
mm,
they could connect and find that part of themselves. And other people, no matter where they are, no matter what language, they relate to them, and their language is love,
yeah.
and that's universal.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it that way. So, um, you do a lot of past life regressions with
Yeah,
people. So, what purpose does that serve? Remembering past lives, because most of us don't remember anything about past lives.
that's a good question, Brian. I mean, my near-death experience, like I said before, I just remember that there's so much more than what we are holding on to as reality that is still there, but we at times forget. And sometimes it could trickle down to some degrees at certain points of our life. But, I don't know about you, but what's the number one question that we're asked? Outside of what happens when we die, it's what's my life's purpose?
Yeah.
I get that all the time. And so for many of us, we've been taught that our life's purpose was to get ahead in a way and to make more and to have more things. And
Mhm.
that's our purpose, and to be financially stable and all that is good. But once you understand that you are not a body experiencing yourself a body, but you're a soul, you understand that this purpose in life goes far beyond the material. This is an experience of our inner being. And
Yeah.
so past life regression is a great way for people to really be, I would say, detectives in a way, and to look for clues as to not totally definite, like this is the one reason why I'm here, but these are possibilities,
Hmm.
that we could reference upon that resonate within ourselves as to why we're here, what's our purpose. And I don't think purpose is just in one thing, like this is your one, it's not unidimensional, we're multidimensional beings. So,
Right.
um, but I think just for the average person, the purpose is to be present on this journey, to see the little things as the big things, and just to kind of walk into this world without leaving the eyes and ears of God. I think that's inner being. And so to look at world through curiosity, through openness, the ability to see beauty beyond the surface, is thinking and acting like God to me.
Oh,
Because
wow.
when I connected to God, God was wasn't looking down at me, it was looking up at me. And it was looking, with unconditional love and acceptance. And So the more that we do that, the more that we don't have to wait to meet God, the more that we are forever interconnected to it, and it's
Yeah.
remember that's a part of us that never left us, that's inside of us. So I think our highest self is forever connected to that. But past life regression, I think, is a great way to give back to, especially to those people who want these NDEs or to want those experiences, to remind themselves that, kind of like the Wizard of Oz, that they had the power inside of themselves the whole time, that they don't
Mhm.
have to like go 1,000 miles an hour or to earn something to get something, that it's always there. I think the interfering part is how we're programmed. Like, it's like we have to sweat and turmoil, to get something. But
Yeah.
it's like that Michelangelo would say, just chip away at the masterpiece that's always been there. He said some things that I don't agree with, but yeah, that part is true.
Yeah. Well,
So,
it's interesting because you talked about life purpose, and I'm being a life coach. People will ask me about, like,
right,
let's find our life purpose, and we typically think of things. It's just like the term soul contract. I
right,
don't really like that term either because it sounds so legalistic and it sounds capitalistic. And
right,
when people think about their life purpose, a lot of times, okay, what am I supposed to do? What's my living? What's that kind of
right,
stuff. And I think there is a more universal life purpose, as you said, is to
right,
experience life, to enjoy life, to
right,
improve our consciousness.
right. We're not a human doing, we're a human being,
Yeah.
right? So I think it's in that beingness, in that presence, living with a mind of the East in a world of the West, right?
Mm.
Living with like a sacred awareness and in a presence in our life. I think that, is important. But I found the best answer is someone says, "What's the meaning of life?" And they answered, to give life meaning or to find meaning,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So we're looking for so much meaning outside of ourselves, but I think to me, the greatest meaning of spirituality comes from the lives that we live itself. You know, our
Right.
experiences, the depth of our experiences, the beauty of our experiences. To me, that's the most spiritual thing that we could do, or have in a way.
Yeah. And the more the older I get, the more I look around, the more I realize that's all that's going to last, right? And like, as we keep saying, everything else here is temporary. So
Right.
we get the job, we get the house, we get the
Right.
whatever, all those things fade away.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think, at times cinema or movies could really speak. I know I referenced The Wizard of Oz, but for people who are really trying to understand what we're vibing to, just watch the movie Big Fish. I don't know if you've ever seen that,
I don't think I've
but
seen that.
it's
No.
it's a it's a wonderful movie. But I don't want to give the whole movie away, but there's just one scene which, I cry every time, but there's a funeral scene. But then at the funeral, you know, the man sees, they have awareness of all the people that was impacted by this man,
Mm.
and it sees the changes
Mm.
from all the people who were impacted by this man. There's like really beautiful music playing, and you just are able to understand the ripple effect. And I think that's what this is all about. Like, we just don't know what impact we have, even
Right.
with with a gentle smile, or but in a sense, I think what's what better praise to say that the world is a better place because you're in it, and cannot be the same without you in it too, without you out of it. So, I think that's the purpose is, we're here for a reason. The world can't exist without you in many ways. You make it. We're all part of this unique note in the symphony of the
Yeah.
universe.
But unique note in the symphony. That's beautiful analogy. And that's, again, that's why I love. I think that's why NDEs are so popular for people to talk about. My most watched episodes are people that have NDEs, because
Right,
we hear these universal truths that we want to hold on to and we want to remember, and we want to know that, even though I'm one of 8 billion people on the planet right now, I do have a unique role. You have a unique role, and
right,
we are touching the people around us. I may not be able to affect all 8 billion people on the planet, but I can have a
right.
lot more impact than I think I do.
Undeniably, we sell ourselves short in so many ways with just how we see ourselves, but we just don't know what impact we have and what we mean to people. And so many times, I mean, I myself struggle with this all the time, and I'm in therapy for it still to this day, and no shame to it. But we just chop ourselves up like crazy, and we just sometimes don't recognize, like,
Mhm.
wow, how much, you know. our words could impact others and how beautiful we can be. And so, right, I had my NDE and I was taking my own life away, but I think my duty was to remembering that life is about giving life to others.
Hmm.
We were given this great gift for ourselves, not just hold on to, but to let go of. And so when others need that life, we could in our own way give it to others. And that's to me the embodiment of God. We're all creators with our
Yeah.
words, with our actions, and I think we're all artists of the mind. People think of artists as just drawing a picture, but to me, I think we're artists of the mind with how we see the world and what canvas is it do we want to draw each and every day,
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
life
That's
is really about being an artist of life itself in the mind.
wow. I love that. I completely agree. I think we're all little fractals of God, to use that word, or creator or source, or whatever word you want to use. We're all made in that, in the Bible says we're made in God's image, and we are all
Right,
creators. And even though just people think of creative like making art or making music, we're creating lives. We're creating our life. We're creating the lives of people around us. We are in this interactive symphony, right?
right,
And I was talking with someone the other day. I said, any interaction with another consciousness that is mutually beneficial is a success. If we come in contact with another person, we both come out of it. And that's the kind of stuff that people in life reviews tell us. People have had NDE said that's what my life review was about.
right, right. And I think it's important to allow ourselves to be human too, right?
Mm,
I mean, certainly in my professional career, geez, I've had very human moments that have been very sobering, stuff that I learned from, but stuff that makes me. So I think a lot of people stop this because they're like, all right, I'm, I'm not congruent exactly with everything that I'm saying. And I think if we, our words we ascribe to, we really aspire to.
hmm.
But if we were to tap into each and every one of our words every day, I think we'd be an angel,
Yeah,
and ideally it's to walk the talk. And that's why each and every day we try to get closer and closer to our truth, not to be separate from it, but to become unified with it. But I think a lot of people give up on themselves because like, who am I? I'm not perfect. I've done this, I've done that, I've done that. So I can't do this. And no, I think it's allowing yourself to be human and understanding with what that comes with.
yeah. Well, I always say to people, if we set these challenges up for ourselves, and if we always succeeded, they wouldn't be very good challenges.
Right,
So sometimes we're not going to be
right,
we're not going to be that perfect, and even as we get better, the challenges can progressively get harder because
right.
we're pushing up against harder things. But
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big sports guys, I know you are too,
mhm,
but it's like you think of the biggest alpha in their field, right? I mean, maybe outside of arguably MJ, like Kobe was that person. They were twin flames to me, like very much cut from the same cloth, Kobe and MJ.
right,
But Kobe was once asked what he thought about failure. He said, "What is failure?" And I was just like floored. Kobe was
uh-huh,
saying that. He says, if you fail on Monday but grow from it Thursday, how is there ever such thing as failure?
yeah, yeah,
It's true. So like we wouldn't be who we are without our own mistakes, our own misjudgments, but those things could make us so much greater. It's kind of like a slingshot. We take a step back, we propel forward.
exactly,
Uh, some people
yeah.
just give up on themselves and they just say, all right, I've done this, I've done that. My life's over. I can't try to recreate or change. It's just undamaged goods and you can't live like that. You got to forgive yourself and you got to move on and just allow yourself to be you and to let go of all the self-judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that again, my perception is we are just as this human part of me. I am a fractal, even of a greater part of me that's still in the non-physical. And but we kind of strip down and we come into this environment, and it's tough, man. It's challenging. And we are going to fail and we're going to stumble. We're going to get caught up in the illusion. We're going to
Yeah,
sometimes forget, we're going to get things are going badly, we lost our
right.
job, whatever, it's going to be like, this place sucks.
But that's important is to be real. I mean, at least for me, like um the spiritual teachers that I describe to, they're very real with themselves. Like I was once,
Yeah,
listening to Neil Donald Walsh, someone who I really connect to, and he was talking about I think Eckhart Tolle on stage, and he's like, he walks the talk. I try to, but I'm not that. But to me, at least, so that that stuck with me. That's something that you could relate to.
Right.
And I think and Christ said this himself, like whatever's inside of me is inside of you.
Hmm.
And I think it's important as a teacher to also allow yourself to be transparent or vulnerable and for others to see parts of themselves in you too, and to not to take away the pedestal because no one is better or we're all a part of God's creations. It's not like you have a hierarchy or whatever. It's everyone has a significance to add, and if you're not seeing that, then it's missing out. We're missing out. We got to find a way to cultivate that potential.
It's funny you mentioned Jesus, and I grew up as a fundamental evangelist
Right,
Christian and was taught that Jesus was perfect and everything. And I remember when the movie The Last Temptation of Christ came out, which was before you were born, probably. But this movie comes out, The Last Temptation of Christ, and it showed Jesus as like human, and he
right.
he had doubts, and he was tempted by women, and I'm like, I thought, if Jesus wasn't tempted, if Jesus didn't have doubts, if Jesus always remembered his divinity, then he wouldn't have had a human experience. He couldn't he
No,
couldn't relate to us.
no. I mean, there's just we could go all day. Like, there's so much. And again, that box is filled with so many people's prior worldview. Even on God, like God is not Judge Judy. God is not, your parents or a principal. It's like
Right,
we
right.
assign authority figures with the ultimate authority, people who think that's a figure of authority. But to many in our country, like I just said, God was, Jesus was not born in a Chick-fil-A. It's not like, like, I
Yeah.
don't know what, like, because he wasn't, he's probably everything that a lot of people just don't like, but if you look at the honest facts, like, he was socialistic. He was, into giving to the poor. He was Middle Eastern. He's
Hmm.
probably more Jewish than I am. So like, wasn't like a lot of what, these kind of, I guess, the European influence depicts as.
Right.
Uh,
But that
it's
idea
different.
of what we would ascribe as perfection, and like I said, when I think about Jesus in particular, because the Christian teachings, he's God incarnate. I'm like, well, that's not fair. He couldn't have been tempted. He couldn't have been any of these things if he didn't forget who he was. I think that's
Right,
part of what we do when you're here. And even though you've had the experience that you've had and still have the
right.
memory of it, I'm sure there are times when you get caught up in the illusion too.
All the time. I mean, I'm driving and I flip the bird and all the time. And there's a saying by Ram Dass where he says, "You think you're good, just ask your family." You know,
Yeah.
family, they'll be like, they'll like roll your eyes, but they'll keep you grounded in a way, and they'll allow you to remind yourself to be human,
Hmm.
to remember that it's okay to be human. That's why we're here. We're here to have both, and we can move the needle at times when one is getting too overbalanced, but to have a balance of both those parts of ourselves, I
Hmm.
think is a beautiful place to live in. And like I said, both things could be true at the same time. It doesn't have to
Hmm.
be, I'm a spiritual being and that's it, and I can't be human, or I'm a human being and I can't be spiritual. We could both be a spiritual being having these unique human experiences.
Yeah. That's you just hit on. I think that's the thing. We are here to have this human experience. We're not here to
Right,
escape it. We're not here to bypass it.
for
We
sure.
are here to experience all the emotions. And I was talking with a guy one time. I was interviewing for my podcast, and he was talking about the purpose, meaning of life, and all the different things we said. We come here to learn. We come here to have experiences. We come here to grow. We know whatever. He goes, and we come here to have a feeling of abandonment. And I said, wait a minute, I've never heard anybody say that before. He goes, yeah, we come here because we're so connected on the other side. We don't know what it's like to be independent, and we can't really grow because there's always everything available to us right now. Every resource is available. So we actually come here to experience that abandonment.
It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think in the moment why we cry because I think it's an adjustment when we're born, but I think it's also a feeling of like a separation from not just the wound of our mother, but the womb of God.
Mm,
And
mm,
I think that's a very big trauma for a lot of people,
mm-hmm,
that we don't recognize how traumatic that is to take from this, place of, just this womb energy or this unconditional love energy of God where, there is no negativity, it's all beauty. Then we come into this world, it's different. And certainly having my NDE, I had like a rebirth period in that sense where
right.
Yeah, I was born, but also it to me felt the same way, where it was just like a rebirth period out of the womb of God into this world, and so that's why many NDErs, celebrate their actual NDE birthday as their birthday. It's a
Wow.
rebirth.
Right.
Um, but it's a it's a weird kind of thing because when we're born, we sob and cry, and when we leave, others cry.
Yeah.
It's like we can't live in a way without God, but others recognize the God within us that they saw, and they can't live without that divinity, that part of the divinity.
What you
So,
just said just reminded me of the Genesis story when they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And again, the
right,
Christian interpretation is original sin, God punished
right.
them. And I have a good friend who's Jewish, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he said the his interpretation he had been taught anyway was that was man coming into wisdom and leaving that idyllic place and kind of striking out on his own to be challenged and to grow. So it's not so much a punishment as a opportunity to grow.
Yeah, I think in a way, a part of us almost gets bored with that. Like we crave the challenge, we crave the resistance. That's like growth in a way. Without the
Mm-hmm.
resistance, I think there's growth in this side, sure, but I think there's more. This is there's more weights on this barbell here.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think there's a lot more resistance here.
Yeah, well, we were talking
Definitely.
about sports analogies earlier, and you think I was just giving a talk the other day, and I was like, I love football, right? And you think about how silly is a football game. You got people, they strap
Right.
on pads, they go out, they oppose each other in a totally artificial conflict, but we love that. We love watching people push themselves to the limits.
I think though that sports is evolving in a way. I think there's a lot. I mean, I think it's like a part of us likes the illusion to be into it,
Right,
that there's us against them, but I think, at times that plug is pulled and people remember that there's one team. I know, for instance, where you're from, with the Buffalo Bills game, against the Bengals, right by you,
right.
geez, I'm forgetting the stadium, but in the Bengals stadium,
Um,
when
Fender or no, Paycor Stadium, but Paul Brown Stadium. Yeah,
yeah, when their safety went down, everything stopped. We just recognized, geez, we're fighting over people bleeding in different jerseys and it's life or death and it's not, and we just remembered, how this isn't life or death and how really, it's about one team, and
right,
we're all just connected. And that was just a moment of healing to me. And so I think sport is great if you're able to understand that it's not life or death and we're all really on the same team at the end of the
right,
day.
right.
And but hopefully through not just wins, but through losses, there could be growth and we could help out each other through the resistance that we bring to grow,
Yeah.
you know?
That is an excellent point, and I'm glad you said that because I tell people again sometimes people are like you shouldn't like football. You're a spiritual person or
Right.
whatever. You shouldn't like football. It's a terrible game. I'm like, but I do like the forgetting that the Pittsburgh Steelers are not really my enemy. I like to root against the Steelers. Now, when that something like happens to Damar Hamlin, that's when we go to that next level, right? So it's just like being here. We come here and we play this game we call life, and we feel like we're separate from other people, and it's us versus them. But at that next level, we know we're all one. And when
Right.
Damar went down, it was just like it was a beautiful moment. You're right; it was a beautiful reminder of how everybody came together, and there was no Bengals
Pretty
and Bills.
much. I mean, outside of Skip Bayless, everyone was on the same page in that situation. But Skip's old school, I get it. But yeah, everyone, it was about life and death, and that's what people reminded that this is just a game. It's not life and death. And so we
Hmm.
don't want to be enslaved by the game of football, but informed of like what it is.
Right,
But being able to see beyond that, and that's life itself. Isn't that life itself, though? Right?
right, and
We have these experiences, but we're not like totally defined by them. They're just experiences, and we're able to see past through them while we're experiencing them. That's a beautiful place to be in.
yeah, and that's I love Manuel Swedenborg, and he talks about
Right.
correspondences and how everything in nature is a correspondence. And if we can take things like the game of football and have that extraction, and then apply that to the game of life, and say, yeah, we're here, we're playing the game, and we're doing all this and this, but ultimately we're all on one team, and ultimately nothing is life or death. I love what you said
Right.
earlier about you gave up I think you said you gave up your life, but you said you can't really give up your life. It's like you gave up your body.
Yeah, my body, right? And I know you have this saying, and I'm paraphrasing, but something like I know I'm not giving the statement justice, Brian, but something like you could plant a body, but you can never plant a soul, or the soul is reborn from the body in a way. You
Yeah,
know, that the soul, just because you might put a body 6 feet under, that does not mean that the soul will too. And I think that's a very important viewpoint regarding grief, because if we hold this picture of life after death with just the body hanging out 6 feet under, I could see that as a very bleak fear. But
absolutely.
why in God's name would the body hang out in this, 6 feet under the cemetery if it could be anywhere? Like, so it doesn't make sense. But again, when we see ourselves as just a body, then that's all will identify us. But we see
Mhm.
ourselves beyond it, we could understand that there's a possibility of life beyond this body, within this body and beyond this body. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's really, I think for me, I view the body more now like a receiver. I view the brain as more of a receiver, more of a
Right.
filter, actually.
Filter. Yeah.
And you mentioned movies earlier. I think Hollywood, I think a lot of that stuff is channeled. And why I had a lot of problems with the movie Avatar. One of the things I loved about the movie was the idea that, you could be in one place and you're operating this body that's not really like who you are, and that's how
Mhm.
we are. I think when we're here, we are operating this body from our higher perspective. Our souls are occupied. It's a virtual reality. We have all these little sensory inputs, and we feel like we're sitting in the room, but we're not really sitting in the rooms that we feel like we're in. Which the Matrix, I think, did an excellent job with.
Oh, I mean, The Matrix and I think Avatar definitely referenced in like a lot of different, higher awareness books and stuff like that. But absolutely. And I think when you're coming from this creative place, it's not coming from you, but through you. And,
Hmm. Hmm.
cinema is a great platform to reach people. I really do believe. But I think The Wizard of Oz, to me at least, that's a very, very higher otherworldly movie.
It absolutely is.
Um, and it just really tells you that home is within. And sometimes we're having this life and it's a dream, but then we come back in a way, that this is all just there's an illusion within life too at the same time, but home is within,
Yeah.
the power is within.
Yeah.
Star Wars, the same thing. I know George Lucas had a near-death experience himself, but what does he say? The force is within.
I just
So
heard that
like,
recently.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. A lot of people, you wouldn't think have had near-death experience. They're not as public with it, but they speak a little bit about it.
Mhm.
Sharon Stone and Tracy Morgan and what's her, Elizabeth Taylor, another near-death Plato, people thought Carl Jung people,
Yeah.
it was said that. So it's nothing new, but I think it's getting a lot more traction now as I think the medical community and scientific community is an ally, not an enemy of this stuff.
Finally.
Um,
Yeah.
and is really, and I think as medical advancement is increasing, that incubation period is increasing too. And so people are able to have these more readily available. And I'm interested to see though if Damar Hamlin had one, because I mean, I know that was a technical one, but as time goes on to see if he experienced anything, because I mean, if you could say, all right, Jamar wouldn't have had that if he was just at his home, but quite honestly, if he wasn't at a football field with medical staff around him, this happened in his sleep, like, he wouldn't have been. So that was in many ways the best place for him to be.
Right. It was.
Um,
Yeah.
and just around all support on deck, versus in his sleep with no one around him. But that was a medical miracle and a miracle, spiritual miracle too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's one of those things I think was meant to happen. I think it opened up a lot of people's eyes to a lot of things. And we saw a
right.
man die and be resurrected.
Right in front of us on national TV.
Yeah.
But you also saw like the illusion of how it was us versus them, and it was just one team.
Right. Right.
And in Kobe's passing, right, people were, on the sport, on the basketball courts, and you saw athletes sobbing and crying and hug each other. It
Hmm.
just reminds you like what life is really about. We're not against each other, we're with each other, and it created more a oneness,
Yeah.
you know, in the most divisive kind of things, like us versus them, and
Right.
we're able to find oneness, beyond that illusion. I think
Yeah.
that's beautiful.
Well, Jacob, remind people of both of your books, the names and where they can get them and where they can contact you.
Yes. So my two books are both available on Amazon, The Wisdom Jacob's Ladder, which just came out a month ago, and Life After Breath. My first book is available on Amazon on paperback and Kindle. Trying to get audio. It's a little technical with my publisher, but they could find me there. And for those interested in inquiries or social media following or appointments, you could find me on my website at jacoblcooper.com. That's jacoblcooper.com. And there hasn't been an email that I don't think I've ever not gotten back to yet. And I try to live up to that, every day. So yeah.
Appreciate it. Man, it's good seeing you again. Thanks for being here.
Ryan, thank you so much for having me. Keep up the amazing work, and it's such an honor. I can't tell you how much respect and admiration and love I have for you.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
All right. Be well. Thank
I'm excited to announce I have a great new resource. It's called GEMS, 4 Steps to Move from Grief to Joy. And what it is, it's 4 things that I've found that I do on a daily basis to help me to navigate my grief. And I'm offering it to you free of charge. It's a free download. Just go to my website, www.grieftogrowth.com/gems, GEMS, and grab it there for free. I hope you enjoy it.